Clara Whitmore pressed her dead father's ring into the stranger's palm, the morning she married him, not as a gift, not as a promise, but because the bank was coming in 6 days and a widow's ring on a drifter's hand was the only legal wall she had left. He looked down at it, looked at her, said nothing. She said nothing. The preacher's voice filled the silence between them like water filling a cracked jar. Outside, the November wind stripped the last leaves off the only tree her father had ever planted. She didn't cry. She'd already decided she was done crying. She had work to do. If that opening stopped your heart even a little, hit subscribe right now and stay with this story all the way to the end. Because where it goes will surprise you. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The town of Harlan Creek, Texas, November 1883. Clara Whitmore had exactly $4.32 to her name. 2 children who hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. A roof with a hole in the northeast corner that let in enough wind to cut through wool. And a stranger sleeping in her barn who hadn't asked her for a single thing since she'd found him collapsed against the fence post 4 mornings ago. She hadn't saved him out of charity. She'd saved him because she needed the fence post fixed, and he was lying on top of it. That was the truth. And Clara had always been a woman who told herself the truth first. Even when it hurt. She was 24 years old. She was what the women at Sunday service called a large girl, with the kind of soft, careful smiles that meant they were being polite about something that wasn't polite at all. Clara was heavy. She had been heavy since she was 12. She had wide hips and full arms and a round face that, if you looked past the exhaustion and the flour dust and the perpetual worry, was actually quite beautiful dark eyes that held steady when other people's didn't. A wide mouth that smiled easily even when smiling cost something. Hair the color of river mud that she kept pinned up because it was practical. Not because anyone was asking her to be pretty. Nobody was asking Clara Whitmore to be pretty. They were asking her to disappear quietly. She'd been hearing it her whole life in the way people talked around her. Too much to feed, too big to hire for anything visible. You'd think with all that size she could do real work. But then you'd see her, and you'd think, no, she'd better stay in the kitchen where nobody has to look at her. Her father had protected her from the worst of it. Joseph Whitmore was a stubborn man with a failing cattle operation and a talent for loving his children harder than he loved good sense. He'd told Clara every morning of her life that she was worth something, that her mind was sharp and her hands were capable, and that any man who couldn't see past the surface of a person wasn't worth the air he was breathing. Joseph Whitmore had died 11 days ago from a lung fever that came on fast and left no room for argument. And Clara had buried him in the frozen ground and walked back to a house with 2 children, $4, and a cattle operation that owed more than it owned. Her son Thomas was 9. Her daughter May was 6. They were not her children by birth. They were her younger brother's children. Orphaned 2 years prior, when fever took him and his wife in the same week, but they were hers in every way that mattered. She had taken them without being asked. She would keep them without being told. That was simply who Clara was. But who Clara was didn't pay the banknote that came due on December 1st. And it was already November 7th. She'd found the stranger on a Thursday morning. He was face down in the frost near the east fence line. One arm stretched out, like he'd been reaching for something when he went down. She'd seen enough downed animals to know the difference between dead and nearly dead. And this man was nearly dead. His chest was moving. Barely, and there was a gash along his left temple that had bled and frozen and bled again. She should have gone for the sheriff. She'd thought about it for a full minute. Standing there in the cold with her breath-making clouds and her boot heel 3 inches from his outstretched hand. Then she'd thought about the fence post he was lying against, which needed to be reset before the cattle pushed through the gap. And the fact that Sheriff Aldous Breck was a man who charged a fee for his time, even when that time involved dragging half-dead strangers off other people's property. She couldn't afford the fee. She'd knelt down and grabbed the man under both arms and pulled. He was heavy, heavier than he looked, which was saying something because even unconscious and collapsed. This was a man who looked like he was built from something harder than ordinary bone. Tall, even lying flat, broad through the shoulders. Hands that were calloused, straight through the palm. She'd gotten him into the barn by sheer stubbornness and a technique she'd developed from moving grain sacks get low. Use your legs, don't stop moving once you've started, because you won't start again. She'd cleaned the gash on his head with water and cloth. She'd covered him with the horse blanket because it was the warmest thing in the barn. She'd gone back to the house and made breakfast for Thomas and May and told them there was a sick man in the barn and they were not to go near him until she said it was all right. May had asked if he was a ghost. Thomas had asked if he was an outlaw. Clara had said she didn't know yet, and that was the honest answer. He'd woken up on the second day. She'd been bringing him broth when he opened his gray eyes. She'd noticed the kind of gray that wasn't dull, but was actually the color of storm clouds right before the lightning. And they'd focused on her immediately, which she'd taken as a good sign about the head wound. "You're in a barn," she'd said, because that seemed like the first thing a person needed to know. "I know what a barn smells like," he'd said. His voice was low and unhurried. The kind of voice that came from a man who'd spent a lot of time in open spaces. "How'd I get here? I dragged you." He'd looked at her for a moment. Not the way men usually looked at her, which was either with pity or with the specific blankness of someone trying not to form an opinion. He'd looked at her the way a person looks at another person when they're genuinely trying to understand what they're seeing. "You dragged me," he'd repeated. "You were on my fence post." Something had moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "My apologies for the inconvenience. The fence post is fine," she'd said. "You're the one who got inconvenienced. Can you tell me your name?" A pause. Just long enough to notice. "Eli," he'd said. "Eli Calloway." She'd handed him the broth. "You have any people I should contact, Mr. Calloway?" "No. Any enemies who'd be coming after you that I should know about?" He'd looked at her again with those storm-colored eyes. "That's a direct question. I have 2 children in that house and a banknote coming due on December 1st, she'd said. "I don't have time for the indirect kind." He'd taken a slow drink of the broth. "Then, no enemies coming after me. Not to this county." She'd taken that for what it was, which was not a complete answer, and left him to rest. He'd started working on the 4th day. She hadn't asked him to. She'd come out at first light to find him resetting the fence post she'd found him on. Working with the slow, deliberate movements of a man whose body was still arguing with him, but whose stubbornness was winning. "You shouldn't be up," she'd said. "Post needed setting," he'd said. Without stopping. "And you didn't strike me as someone who hires things out. I don't hire things out because I can't afford to hire things out." "I know." He'd driven the post another inch into the frozen ground. "I'm not asking you to pay me. I can't accept charity." "Mr. Calloway." He'd straightened then and looked at her over the fence line. The morning was gray and cold, and his breath was making the same clouds hers was. "I'm not offering charity, Miss Whitmore. I'm offering to work for room in the barn, and whatever meals you can spare. Until I'm back on my feet enough to move on. That's not charity. That's a transaction." She'd thought about it. She'd weighed it. She'd looked at the cattle that needed moving, and the roof that needed patching, and the woodpile that wasn't going to build itself. "Fine," she'd said. "But I need to know you're not a wanted man." "I will not have law trouble on this property. I'm not a wanted man," he'd said. Quiet. Steady. The kind of voice that didn't bother to argue because it didn't feel it needed to. "All right, then," she'd said. "Breakfast is at 6. He worked the way he talked without waste. By the end of the first week, the fence line was secure. The northeast corner of the roof was patched, and he'd moved enough wood from the back stand to keep them through January. He learned Thomas's schedule without being told and had the barn chores done before the boy came out to help each morning, which meant Thomas got an extra 20 minutes of sleep. He figured out, somehow, that May was frightened of the old bay gelding in the far stall and started leaving the stall gate open wider so the horse seemed less trapped. And within 3 days, May was bringing the animal a carrot each morning, like she'd always done it. Clara noticed all of this. She noticed it and said nothing because saying something would have required her to feel something. And she did not currently have the resources for that. What she had resources for was survival and survival. In November of 1883 meant finding $60 before December 1st. It was Thomas who heard the men from the bank talking in town. He'd gone with Eli to pick up a few supplies. Clara had given him $3 of her $4 and told him to stretch it, and at the general store he'd overheard 2 men in suits talking to Mr. Garner behind the counter. Thomas reported it back to Clara with the faithful precision of a 9-year-old who understood more than most adults gave him credit for. They said Whitmore land was going to go at auction if the note didn't get paid by 1st of December, Thomas said. They said it like they were happy about it. Clara set down the pot she was holding. They said anything else? They said Thomas hesitated. They said it was good land, said it'd go for a fair price. That a decent operation could run cattle there if somebody who knew what they were doing was in charge. The implication was clear even to a 9-year-old. The land was worth something. The woman holding it was not, in their estimation, someone who knew what she was doing. Clara picked the pot back up. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "Go wash up for supper." She'd been sitting at the kitchen table with her father's ledger for 2 hours when Eli came in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway and read the room the way a man reads weather quickly and without needing to be told. "Bank trouble?" he said. "Nothing I can't handle. How much?" "Mr. Calloway, how much is the note?" She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand and mud on his boots and no expression on his face that she could read clearly. And she was tired enough and frightened enough that the truth came out before she could choose something more dignified. $60, she said. "I have due December 1st. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was starting its evening run across the open ground. "I have a solution," he said. "If it involves you riding somewhere and coming back with money." "I don't want to know where you got it." "It doesn't." He pulled out a chair at the other end of the table and sat down, which was something he'd never done before. He always stayed at the edges of the house, like a man who wasn't sure he'd been invited past the threshold. "It involves a marriage certificate." Clara stared at him. "Hear me out," he said before she could speak. "If we marry, the bank can't foreclose without dealing with both of us. A married woman with a working ranch hand on the property is a different legal situation than a single woman behind on a payment. I know that," because he paused, "because I know how these things work. We marry on paper. You keep the land. When spring comes and you're back on stable ground, we figure out what comes next. That is the most practical," he said. "It is the most practical solution to your problem that doesn't involve losing your father's land." Clara looked at him. Really looked at him. She'd been careful, since that first morning, not to really look at Eli Calloway, because he was the kind of man that looking at cost something. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that would have been handsome in any company's strong jaw. The storm-gray eyes, a mouth that was usually set in a line, but occasionally did something that wasn't quite a smile. He'd been beat up by something in his recent past. She could see that there were old troubles in the set of his shoulders. The way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and looked at nothing for a moment before resuming. But his hands were steady, and his word had been good for every day she'd known him, which was 11 days, which was not enough to trust a man. But sometimes you only got 11 days. You'd be getting nothing out of it, she said. I'd be getting a barn to sleep in through winter, he said. And I happen to like this particular barn, Mr. Calloway. Eli, she said his name for the first time. It felt strange. People will talk. People already talk. He said it simply and without meanness. And the truth of it settled between them, like a stone dropping in still water. He'd been in town with her twice. He'd heard the things people said. He was acknowledging it, without making it into something she had to be embarrassed about. They'll say I trapped you, she said. They'll say, Miss Whitmore. He met her eyes directly. With all respect, I don't care what they say. The question is whether you care enough about what they say to lose your father's land over it. Silence. The wind outside. The fire settling in the stove. Clara looked at her father's ledger. At the numbers that didn't add up. At the column for December 1st that had nothing in it. She thought about Thomas's face when he'd reported what the men at the general store had said. The way he'd tried to protect her from the worst of it, and hadn't quite managed. She thought about May and the carrot she brought the old bay gelding every morning. She thought about Joseph Whitmore, who'd told her every morning of her life that she was worth something. She thought he'd want me to keep the land. All right, she said. Eli Calloway nodded once, like a man who'd offered a business arrangement and had the business arrangement accepted. I'll find out where the county clerk's office is, he said. They were married on a Friday morning. The county clerk's name was Mr. Tibbs, and he had a mole on his left cheek that Clara found herself staring at during the brief ceremony because it was easier to look at than anything else in the room. Thomas and May stood beside her. Thomas was solemn. May held Clara's hand and swung it slightly, which was what she did when she was nervous. Eli stood at Clara's right and held himself with the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to waiting out difficult moments. When Mr. Tibbs asked if anyone present had objection, he looked specifically at the empty room as if expecting someone to materialize from the wallpaper. No one did. When he asked Eli if he took Clara as his lawful wife, Eli said, I do, in the same voice he used to confirm which cattle he'd moved that morning, steady. Clear, without drama. When he asked Clara, her voice caught for just 1 second before she said it. Just 1 second, then she said it. I do. Mr. Tibbs stamped the certificate. The mole on his cheek moved as he pressed down. They walked out into the November street as husband and wife. And Clara held the certificate in her left hand and felt the weight of the most practical decision she had ever made in her life. And tried to remember that practical was enough. It had to be enough. She did not look at Eli's face. He did not look at hers. Thomas looked at both of them with the expression of a boy trying to understand the rules of a new game and not quite having all the pieces yet. May tugged Clara's hand. Are you happy? May asked. Clara looked down at her, 6 years old, brown eyes wide and waiting. Yes, baby, Clara said. I'm going to be just fine. The town knew by Saturday morning. Clara could tell by the way Mrs. Holt at the dry goods store took 3 extra seconds before speaking to her, and the way the pause was filled with the particular kind of assessment that women in small towns had perfected, the head-to-toe read that started at your shoes and ended at your pride. I heard you got married, Mrs. Holt said. Yes, ma'am. To that drifter who's been working your land. My husband has been working the ranch. Yes. Mrs. Holt's mouth pressed together. You know nothing about that man. Clara Whitmore. He could be anyone. He's Eli Calloway, Clara said. My husband.
I'll take 4 yards of that wool, please.
If you don't mind. She paid for the wool. She walked out. She did not let her chin drop until she was half a block away and certain no one was looking. Then she set it back up again, because letting it drop was a luxury she couldn't afford any more than she could afford $60. The hardest part wasn't the town. The hardest part was the house. There was only 1 bedroom. Clara had been sleeping in it with May since Thomas had claimed the small room off the kitchen as his own domain 2 years prior, which she'd allowed because he was 9 and 9-year-old boys needed something they could call theirs. The arrangement, then, was clear. Eli would continue sleeping in the barn. It was the only practical solution, and Clara had told herself this 14 times since Friday morning. She told herself this on Saturday night when she woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of Eli. Moving in the barn, she could hear the soft footfall even from the house. And she lay there in the dark and thought about the fact that her husband was sleeping in the cold because there was nowhere else to put him. She told herself this on Sunday when May asked at breakfast why Eli didn't eat with them. "He eats when the work's done," Clara said. "But he's family now," May said, with the devastating simplicity of a 6-year-old. "Shouldn't family eat together?" Clara looked at her eggs. "Set an extra place," she said. The first meal they ate together as a family was Sunday noon. Eli came in from the barn and stopped short in the doorway when he saw the 4 places set. "May's idea," Clara said, not looking up from the biscuit she was moving from the pan. He sat down. He took his hat off. He set it on the hook by the door, which was something he hadn't done before. He'd always kept his hat when he came inside, like a man maintaining his option to leave quickly. Thomas watched him with narrow, assessing eyes over the rim of his cup. "You know how to rope?" Thomas asked. "I know how to rope," Thomas said. "Better than Mr. Calhoun down the road." "I don't know Mr. Calhoun. He says he's the best roper in Harlan County. I expect there are a few men who say that. Are you better than him?" Eli picked up his fork. "Pass me those biscuits, and I'll consider demonstrating tomorrow if the weather holds." Thomas passed biscuits with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the family of one. May, for her part, immediately told Eli that the bay gelding in the far stall was named Captain, and that he liked carrots, and that she had decided Eli could help her feed him if he wanted. "I'd like that very much," Eli said. May nodded, satisfied, and went back to her biscuit. Clara sat at the head of the table, her father's place, which she'd taken the day after he died and hadn't relinquished, and watched this man she'd married 11 days after meeting him sit in her house and be careful with her children and talk to her nephew like he was a person worth talking to. And she thought, "I do not know you, Eli Calloway. I do not know where you came from, or what you left behind, or why a man with hands like yours and eyes like yours, and that particular quality of knowing more than he says, is sleeping in my barn and fixing my fence posts for the privilege. But I know this, whatever you are, you have been nothing but decent to me and to these children since the moment you opened your eyes in that barn." And in Harlan Creek, Texas, in November of 1883, decent was rarer than gold and twice as valuable. She passed him the gravy. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it," she said. The snow started the last week of November. It came hard and fast, and with the kind of settled intention that told anyone who'd lived in this part of Texas that it wasn't planning to leave for a while. The cattle bunched up against the south fence. The water trough started icing by morning. The woodpile became the most important thing on the property. Eli was up before the sun every morning and moving. Clara was up after him, getting breakfast for Thomas and May, and she watched him through the window, sometimes in the gray pre-dawn dark, working in the cold with the same steady efficiency he brought to every task. And she tried not to think about what she was feeling, because what she was feeling was something she couldn't currently afford. It was on the 3rd day of the snow that she found the shirt. She'd gone to the barn for a bucket she'd left there, and she found Eli's spare shirt folded on the stall rail. He only had 2, and she picked it up to move it out of the way, and something fell from the breast pocket. A letter, folded many times. The paper was good quality. Not the paper of a drifter. The writing on the outside, in a careful hand, Mr. Elias Cole Hartwell, personal correspondence. Clara held it. Not Eli Calloway. She stood very still in the cold barn with the letter in her hand, and the snow coming down outside, and the sound of Eli of Elias moving somewhere toward the water troughs. And she understood, with the slow and certain settling of something she'd been trying not to know. That the man sleeping in her barn had given her a name that was not entirely his own. She put the letter back, she put the shirt back. She went back to the house and finished breakfast and called the children in from the cold, and set Eli's place at the table and said nothing. But that night, sitting at her father's desk, with the marriage certificate in her hands and the snow pressing against the window glass, Clara Whitmore, Clara Calloway, the paper said, though perhaps that was not the truth of it, looked at the name she'd signed beside and thought, "Who are you? And what did you bring to my door? And what happens to me and these children when winter finally breaks and you decide to tell the truth?" The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind moved over the frozen land. Clara folded the certificate and put it away and went to bed and lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the silence of a house that had changed in ways she was only beginning to measure. She found the letter on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning she had almost convinced herself it meant nothing. Almost. Clara was good at almost. She'd spent the better part of her life almost believing the things she told herself, that the whispers in town didn't land, that the weight of other people's judgments rolled off her like water off oilskin, that she was fine, that she was managing, that she did not need anyone to see her as anything other than what she presented to the world each morning when she pinned her hair up and put her boots on and walked out to face whatever the day intended to throw at her. But the name on that letter had gotten under her skin in a way she couldn't pin back up. Not Eli Cole Hartwell. She said it to herself sometimes. In the quiet moments between tasks, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone you'd found in an unexpected place, not alarmed. Exactly, but aware that something underneath it might move. She said nothing to him. That was her first decision, made before the sun came up on Wednesday and held firm through the rest of the week. She said nothing because she didn't know what to say. And Clara Whitmore had been raised by a man who believed you didn't open your mouth until you knew what needed to come out of it. Joseph Whitmore's voice in her head, patient and gruff. "Think first, Clara girl. Words have weight. Don't throw them till you know where they're landing." So she thought. She watched. She kept setting his place at the table and passing us and listening to Thomas quiz about roping techniques and watching May drag him to captain's stall every morning with the absolute authority of a 6-year-old who had decided something was hers to decide. And she watched Eli Elias Eli. She kept thinking of him as Eli because that was the name he'd given her, and she wasn't ready to give that up yet, work her land like a man who had something to prove to himself. Not to her. That was the thing that kept snagging her. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't performing effort for her benefit. He was just working, steadily and completely, in the way of a man who knew what work was for and what it cost and what it bought. And Clara recognized that quality because she had it herself. And recognizing it in someone else after years of people treating her own labor as invisible did something to her chest that she refused to name. She wasn't ready to name it. She had other things to manage. The banknote came through on November 28th, 3 days before December 1st, which was either the bank's way of being considerate or their way of making sure she had maximum time to feel the weight of it. The amount was confirmed, $60. The date was confirmed, December 1st, 9 a.m. at the county office. She put the notice on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment and then went to find Eli. He was in the far field, moving the cattle back toward the shelter of the south barn. And he saw her coming and stopped what he was doing with that particular attentiveness he had the way he oriented toward her when she approached. Not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to itself, but with a kind of quiet focus that she was trying not to read too much into. "Bank notice came," she said. He took it from her. "Read it." Handed it back. "I have some money," he said. She stared at him. "What?" "Not $60. He met her eyes directly. "22. It's what I had on me when I went down by your fence line. Kept it in my boot because short, old habit. It's yours if you want it. I don't want your money." Eli. It's not charity. Call it wages. I forgot to mention I was drawing. That is not how wages work, Clara. He said her name the way he said most things without flourish, but with a weight behind it that made you hear it. This was the first time he'd used her given name directly in conversation, and it landed differently than she'd expected. Take the $22. Let me ride to Millhaven on Friday and see what I can find out about a short-term note. I know a man there, he's straight. She crossed her arms. You know a man in Millhaven. I know people in a few places. Eli. She held his gaze. Who are you? He didn't look away. Most men would have looked away. I'm the man who's trying to help you keep your father's land. That is not an answer to the question I asked. No, he said quietly. It isn't. But it's the true part of the answer. And right now the true part is the part that matters most. A beat. Will you let me ride to Millhaven? Clara looked at him. She looked at the notice in her hand. She thought about Thomas's face and May's carrot and the lease of land that her father had worked for 22 years. Fine, she said. But Eli... She stepped closer, close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze because he had several inches on her. And she held that gaze firm. When this is settled, when the land is safe, I am going to ask you again who you are. And I am going to need a real answer. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or something close to it. When the land is safe, he said. You'll get one. She turned and walked back toward the house, and told herself the warmth in her chest was from the cold air and nothing else. She was getting better and better at lying to herself. He left for Millhaven before dawn on Friday and was back by Thursday evening. And Clara didn't let herself stand at the window watching for him. Except that she did exactly once, for approximately 4 minutes before Thomas came in asking about supper and broke the spell. He came back with a promissory arrangement from a man named Wallace in Millhaven, 30 days grace on the remaining balance. Interest held, contingent on a partial payment of $22 made at the county office before December 1st. $22. His money. The money from his boot. Wallace agreed to this? She asked, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the paperwork between them. Wallace is a fair man. Wallace is a banker in Millhaven who extended grace to a woman he's never met in a county he doesn't operate in. On the word of a man who came to see him with $22 and presumably a compelling argument. She looked up. What did you tell him about yourself? Eli folded his hands on the table. He had big hands, she'd noticed, that from the first day, with the kind of scars that didn't come from ordinary ranch work, but that she'd stopped letting herself speculate about. I told him enough. Eli. The land is safe through January, he said. That's 30 days to figure out the rest. I've been looking at your cattle numbers. If you sell the 3 steers that are underperforming, you can clear the balance and still keep the herd whole enough to carry through spring. I can take them to market in Dalton if you want. I know a buyer there who'll give you fair weight. Clara stared at him. You know a buyer in Dalton? Yes, and a banker in Millhaven. Yes, and your name, she said. Very carefully as Eli Calloway, he held her gaze. That's the name I gave you. The kitchen was very quiet. May was asleep. Thomas was in his room. The snow was doing its slow, patient work against the windows. I found a letter, Clara said. In your breast pocket. I wasn't looking, I moved the shirt by accident. I put it back, I haven't touched it since. She paused. It was addressed to Elias Cole Hartwell. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He breathed once, slow. Clara, I am not asking you to explain yourself tonight, she said. And her voice was steadier than she expected it to be, which was something she was quietly grateful for. I made a practical arrangement with you, and the practical arrangement is holding. And I am not going to pull the thread loose before the land is safe. She folded her hands on top of his paperwork. But I need you to know that I know, because I will not live in my own house being managed. Do you understand me? A long moment. Then yes. She stood up. Dinner's keeping warm on the stove. Help yourself. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. But she lay very still and breathed steadily, and told herself that she had handled that with dignity. And Joseph Whitmore's voice in her head said, "That's my girl." And that had to be enough. December arrived, and with it came the kind of cold that had opinions about you. It settled into the walls of the house and found every gap and made itself at home. And Clara responded to it the way she responded to most adversaries, by being more stubborn than it was. She banked the fires early, hung extra wool at the drafty windows, made hot breakfast before the sun was fully up, and kept moving because movement was warmth, and warmth was survival, and survival was the only thing currently on the agenda. Eli was up before her every morning. She'd stopped being surprised by this. She'd started being grateful for it, in the way you become grateful for the sunrise, not with active emotion. Just with the quiet recognition that it was there, and that its absence would be felt. The town, for its part, had decided to have feelings about the marriage. Clara encountered these feelings on the first Wednesday of December, when she went to pick up a supply order from Garner's General Store, and found herself the subject of a conversation that its participants had not entirely finished having before she walked through the door. Mrs. Aldrich and Mrs. Fowler, both of them women Clara had known since childhood. Both of them members of the Sunday Service Committee. Both of them possessed of the specific talent some women develop for making concern sound like generosity while operating as neither. Clara. Mrs. Aldrich recovered first. "We were just talking about you," I heard Clara said pleasantly, and moved to the counter. "We're worried is all, Mrs. Fowler said. Her voice had that particular softness that meant she was about to say something that wasn't soft at all. "You married so quickly, and no one knows anything about this man. A drifter, they're saying. Found him on your property. My husband has been working my father's land and keeping my family fed through the hardest month we've had in 3 years, Clara said. She kept her eyes on Mr. Garner as he assembled her order. "I don't know what additional qualifications you'd require. It's just..." "Mrs." Fowler lowered her voice. "A man like that, Clara. And you must see how it looks." Clara turned then. She turned and she looked at Mrs. Fowler directly. And she kept her expression very still because she had long practice at keeping her expression still when she wanted it to do something else entirely. "How does it look, Miriam?" she said. Mrs. Fowler blinked. "Well, a woman in your position, alone, and a man with no history. No roots. You mean a woman who looks like me," Clara said. "Quiet, clear, without heat. You mean you're surprised that a man who looks like Eli Calloway married a woman who looks like me? And you're trying to find the polite way to say that whatever his reasons are, they can't be real ones." The silence in the store had weight to it. Mr. Garner had stopped moving behind the counter. Mrs. Fowler's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I appreciate the concern," Clara said, and turned back to her order. "Mr. Garner, I'll take that flour too if you have it." She carried her supplies out to the wagon. She climbed up onto the seat. She gathered the reins, and she sat there for exactly 3 seconds before her hands started shaking. And she let them shake for those 3 seconds, and then she made them stop. And she drove home. She didn't tell Eli what Mrs. Fowler had said. She had no intention of telling him. He found out anyway. Small towns had their own economy of information, and Harlan Creek was no exception. By the following Sunday, Eli had heard 3 versions of what had happened at Garner's store. Each one slightly more embellished than the last, and Clara could tell he'd heard something by the particular quality of his silence. At the Sunday noon meal, it was a different kind of silence than his usual silence, which was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't demand anything. This was the silence of a man sitting with something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. Thomas noticed, too, with the radar of a child who'd grown up in a house with adult tension and had developed acute sensitivity to its frequencies. He looked between Eli and Clara twice, and then applied himself to his food with focused determination. May, who had no such radar, and would not have heeded it if she did, said, "Eli, Why do you look like you swallowed something sideways? Thomas made a strangled sound. Clara pressed her lips together. Eli looked at May with an expression that was as close to startled as Clara had ever seen on his face. Then, to his credit, the corner of his mouth moved. Do I? You look like Captain looks when he doesn't want to go back in his stall, May said. With complete authority, all stiff in the neck, Clara started. She's not wrong, Eli said. He set down his fork. He looked at Clara across the table, and this time the look had something direct in it that she hadn't seen before, or rather, something he wasn't bothering to be careful about in the way he usually was. I heard about Garner's store. It wasn't nothing. She held his gaze. I have been managing other people's opinions of me since I was 12 years old. I know you don't need me to manage it for you, he said. I know that, but I'm going to say something, and I'd like you to let me say it. He waited. Clara said nothing, which he took, correctly, as permission. What those women said was wrong, not just unkind. Wrong. And I know that me saying so doesn't fix the saying of it. But I want it said between us, clearly. He paused. You are the most capable person I have met in the last 2 years. You run this operation with no margin for error, and you do it with those two. He glanced at Thomas and May. With your family, and you don't ask for anything you think you can manage without. Which means you almost never ask for anything at all. And any person who looks at you and sees less than that is making a mistake about what matters. The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas stared at his plate with the concentrated study of a boy, pretending he wasn't hanging on every word. May, wide-eyed, looked at Clara. Clara looked at Eli. She felt something move in her chest. Not the warmth she'd been refusing to name this was something sharper. Something that required more careful management. Thank you, she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. He nodded once and picked up his fork. May reached over and patted Clara's hand, apparently satisfied that whatever sideways thing Eli had swallowed had been dealt with, and returned to her biscuit, under the table, without thinking about it. Clara turned her hand over and briefly squeezed May's small fingers. She didn't look at Eli again until she was sure her face had settled. The first real crack in his composure came on a Wednesday afternoon. It came from the direction of the East Road, which was the road from Harlan Creek proper. And it came in the form of a man on a gray horse who rode up to the fence line and stopped and called out for Mr. Calloway by name. Clara was in the side yard when she heard it. She went to the corner of the house and saw the man on the horse, well dressed for Harlan Creek. Coat that hadn't come off a general store rack, horse that was too good for a man who had ordinary businesses in this county. He was 40-something, with a broad jaw and the bearing of a man who was used to his requests and treated as instructions. She saw Eli come from the direction of the barn. She saw him see the man on the gray horse. She saw what happened to his body in that moment. It was subtle. The change. But she'd been watching him for over a month, and she knew his physical language the way you learn any language through daily exposure. And what she saw was recognition followed immediately by control. The kind of control that comes from practice, a door closing behind his eyes. Dowd, Nada Eli said, an acknowledgement. Mr. Calloway. The man on the horse said the name with a very slight emphasis that meant he'd heard it. Considered it and had opinions about it. Orshasai Calloway is fine, Eli said. And his voice had a new quality in it, still quiet, but with something under it that Clara hadn't heard before. Something with edges. What brings you to Harlan County? Business, Dowd said. He hadn't gotten off his horse. That was deliberate. Clara thought a man who stayed on his horse when speaking to someone on the ground was making a point about height. Your brother's business, specifically. Eli said nothing. He's been looking for you for 8 months, Dowd said. Since you left Hartwell Station without a word to anyone. He paused. And Clara knew, from 50 feet away, that he'd done it on purpose, left the name out there, in the open air, where anyone nearby could hear it. The family has questions. The family can keep them, Eli said. Mr. Hart Calloway. Firm final. The kind of final that didn't invite argument. I'm not going back. Whatever you've been sent here to say. I've heard it before. You can tell my brother I'm well. I'm working, and I don't need anything from Hartwell Station. Dowd looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved just briefly, with the practiced casualness of a man who did it professionally, to the corner of the house where Clara was standing. She didn't move. She held the man's gaze when he found it, which took him a moment to process because he'd clearly expected her to look away. Dowd looked back at Eli. You're a married man, then? I see. That's right. Your brother will want to know. My brother can know whatever he wants. It won't change my answer. Eli took a step toward the fence. Unhurried, but the intent of it was clear. You have a long ride back. Dowd. I'd start it before the light goes. Dowd sat on his horse for 4 more seconds, Clara counted, and then gathered his reins and turned without another word and rode back toward the east road. Eli watched him go. Clara watched Eli. When Dowd was far enough down the road, Eli turned. He saw her standing there. He had known she was there the whole time. She understood that now. He'd known, and he'd let her hear it, and he hadn't tried to move her out of earshot. She walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away. Between them, the cold air. Hartwell Station, she said. He held her gaze. No flinching, no deflection, just the steady acknowledgement of a man who knew he'd been caught and had decided to stand in it. Yes. That's your family's property. It was my family's property. It's my brother's now, legally speaking. My father's bequest. And 8 months ago, without telling anyone, a pause. I had reasons, I don't doubt that, Clara said. I also don't doubt that Elias Cole Hartwell, walking off from a family property in the middle of the night, or whatever it was, is considerably more complicated than a drifter sleeping on a fence post. Yes, he said quietly. It is. She looked at him, the cold between them. The east road empty now. Are you in danger, she said. I need to know that. Not for me. For Thomas and May. Direct. Immediate. No pause to consider. No, I am not in danger. And I will not bring danger to this house. If I believed for a moment that was possible, I'd have left before you found that letter. She believed him. She didn't know why she believed him as completely as she did. Only that she had good instincts about people. She'd had to develop them. Given the people she'd had to navigate, and her instincts said this was the truest thing he'd said to her yet. All right, she said. He blinked, just slightly, as if he'd been expecting something harder. All right, he repeated. You said when the land is safe. You'd give me a real answer. The land isn't safe yet. We're still in January's grace period. She turned toward the house. When it is, I'll expect the full story. Until then, keep working. She heard him exhale behind her. Not relief. Exactly. Something more complicated. She didn't turn around. January moved like water over stone, slow and cold and constant, wearing down the edges of things. The steers went to the buyer in Dalton in the second week of January. Eli handled the transport and the negotiation, and he came back with $64 for more than the balance owed, which Clara had not expected. He paid fair weight. Like I said he would, Eli told her at the kitchen table that evening. She looked at the money, counted it, looked up at him. The buyer in Dalton. Yes. Did the buyer owe Elias Cole Hartwell a beat? We've done business. Of course you have. She set the money down and folded her hands. Eli, I need to understand something. These people, you know, the banker in Millhaven, the buyer in Dalton, the man on the gray horse, they represent a life you left. A life with more resources than a drifter sleeping on a fence post. Yes. So when you showed up on my land with $22 in your boot, that was genuine, he said. I didn't have access to anything else. I'd made a point of it. He paused. And something in his expression shifted into something older and more tired. When I left Hartwell Station, I took $25 and the clothes on my back. I wanted to know what I was worth without the name. Without the property. He looked at his hands. That sounds like something a man does when he's lost himself, Clara said quietly. His eyes came up to hers. My father did something like it once, she said. After my mother died, he went away for 6 weeks and came back and never told any of us where he'd been. But when he came back, she stopped, swallowed. He was more like himself than he'd been in years. The kitchen was quiet. The fire, the wind. I was not good company before I left, Eli said finally. He seemed to search for the word. I was becoming my father. And my father was a man who knew the price of everything and the worth of nothing. I didn't want to be that. And did you find what you were looking for? She asked. In $25 and a fence post? He looked at her for a long moment. Something quiet and careful moved across his face. I think I might be finding it, he said. Very low. Very level. The fire popped. Clara's heart did something she was absolutely not going to acknowledge. The county office opens at 9, she said, standing up. We should be there when it does. She carried her cup to the wash basin and did not look at him again. But she could feel his gaze on her back, steady and warm. All the way across the kitchen. They paid off the note on a Thursday morning. Mr. Tibbs at the county office took their $60 with the mole on his cheek, doing its usual work, and stamped the receipt and handed it back and said something perfunctory about congratulations, and Clara held the receipt in both hands on the way out to the street and stood in the cold January air and felt 64 days of held breath leave her body all at once. Eli was standing beside her, just there, in the particular way he had of being present without requiring anything from it. Done, he said. Done, she said. They stood there for a moment. The street moved around them. A wagon. 2 men talking outside the hardware store. Mrs. Aldrich crossing the far side with a basket, who saw them and looked away quickly, which Clara noted and filed and did not spend further energy on. Then Thomas, who had been allowed to come for the occasion, slipped his hand into Clara's. She looked down at him. He looked up at her with the solemn brown eyes of a boy who understood more than he said and chose to express it this way. She squeezed his hand. He nodded, once, like a small man conducting official business, and then looked up at Eli. Does this mean we get to keep the cattle? All except 3, Eli said. The 3 you sold were the slow ones anyway, Thomas said, with the authority of a boy who had opinions about livestock. They were, Eli agreed. Seriously, you've got a good eye. Thomas stood slightly straighter. Something about that posture, the inches it added. The pride in it moved through Clara's chest like a blade. She looked at Eli over Thomas's head, and she found him already looking at her. And this time neither of them looked away immediately. The moment stretched between them, not uncomfortably, but with the particular weight of something that had been building and was now beginning to be acknowledged. She looked away first. But breakfast, she said. There's a place on Mill Street that does eggs and coffee. Can I have pie? Thomas asked. You may have pie, Clara said. They walked together down the main street of Harlan Creek. The 3 of them, in the cold January sun, and for the first time since she'd signed her name next to his in that county office. Clara Whitmore allowed herself to feel just briefly the particular weight of what she had built by accident or by necessity or by the grace of a fence post at the right moment. She didn't know yet what it would become. She didn't know yet what the full story of Elias Cole Hartwell would mean for the life she was trying to rebuild on land her father had left her. She didn't know what it meant that a man with a family property and a banker in Millhaven and a buyer in Dalton was eating her biscuits and feeding May's horse and teaching her nephew to read cattle and sleeping in her barn because he'd asked her if he could stay, and she hadn't had the sense to say no. But she knew this: the land was safe. The children were fed. The note was paid. And walking beside her in the January cold was a man who had $22 in his boot and 8 months of running from something behind him and storm gray eyes that didn't look away when they should be. And Clara thought, in the furthest, most carefully guarded room of herself. Whatever you are, Eli Calloway, whatever the whole truth of you turns out to be, I am not sure I'm going to be able to stay practical about it. She did not say this out loud. She was not ready to say it out loud. But Thomas was eating his pie by the window of the Mill Street Cafe, and May was at home with the neighbor's daughter, who'd come to sit with her. And the receipt for $60 was in Clara's coat pocket. And the man beside her was putting sugar in his coffee with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. And the morning was cold, and the town was moving around them, and the land, her father's land, was safe. For now, that was everything. For now, it was enough. February came in like a man with a grudge. The cold that January had worn like a coat, February wore like a weapon, and it found every weakness in the Whitmore property with the systematic of something that had been waiting all season to make its point. The north pasture fence buckled in 3 places under the weight of ice. 2 of the remaining cattle developed a cough that Eli watched with the focused concern of a man who knew what livestock's sickness could cost and was not prepared to pay it. The well in the side yard froze solid on the 4th morning of the month, which meant hauling water from the creek twice a day, before the creek itself decided to make that harder. Clara did not complain. Complaining required energy she didn't have and time she couldn't spare. And besides, Joseph Whitmore had raised her to understand that February was simply what winter looked like when it stopped being polite about it. You worked through it. That was the only option. But February brought something else with it. Something that couldn't be hauled or fixed or banked against with extra wool. It brought Eli Calloway, or Elias Cole Hartwell, or whoever the full truth of him turned out to be, into the daily life of this household with a completeness and an ease that Clara had not planned for and was not sure how to manage. He was no longer sleeping in the barn. That had happened in the 2nd week of January, after a temperature drop that Thomas had come to find her about with the particular look of a child who was trying to be diplomatic about a practical problem. The water in the barn bucket froze overnight, Thomas had reported, standing in her bedroom doorway in the gray morning. All the way through, Clara had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds. "Tell Mr. Calloway to move his things to the back room," she'd said. The back room was small and cold and used primarily for storage. But it had a wall shared with the kitchen fireplace, and it did not have a frozen bucket. Thomas had gone. Eli had moved his things, which were few enough that the moving took 1 trip without comment or ceremony. He'd thanked her once, briefly, in the way he had of making even gratitude sound like a simple statement of fact. And that had been that. So now he was in the house. In the mornings before the sun was up, Clara could hear him moving in the back room. And then the sound of the back door as he went out to start the morning work. And the particular quality of the house changed from the hollow quiet of a structure without enough people in it to something that felt, in ways she was trying not to examine too closely, more like what it had been when her father was alive. She noticed this and did not speak of it. She had a policy. The thing she could not maintain her policy about was the evenings. In the evenings, after supper, when May was in bed and Thomas was in his room with whatever book he was currently consuming with the ferocious focused hunger he brought to reading, Eli would sit at the kitchen table and Clara would sit across from him, and this was the part she hadn't planned for. The part that had crept up on her like frost, silent and pervasive talk. Not always about important things. Not always about the ranch or the cattle or the money or the question of who he actually was. Sometimes about her father, which was Eli's doing. He'd asked about him once. Casually, and Clara had found herself talking for 40 minutes and only realized it when the fire had burned low and she'd had to get up to bank it. Sometimes about Thomas and his reading, and whether it was normal for a 9-year-old to be working through agricultural almanacs as leisure material. Sometimes about nothing at all, which was the version that frightened her most. Because nothing at all felt the most like something real. She knew what was happening. She was not unintelligent, and she was not naive, and she had read enough of her mother's old novels, worn soft at the spines, to recognize the shape of the thing that was developing in her kitchen in the February cold. She just hadn't decided what to do about it yet. Telegram arrived on a Tuesday. And it changed everything. She didn't know it would change everything when it came. It looked like an ordinary telegram crisp paper. The clerk's efficient hand, her name at the top. But the return address was Hartwell Station. The name beneath it was Caldwell Hartwell, and even though Clara had only heard that name once, from a man on a gray horse in November, she recognized its weight immediately. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment, and then went to find Eli. He was at the water trough, breaking the morning ice with the methodical focus he brought to all physical work. And he turned when he heard her coming and saw what was in her hand, and his face did the thing, the door closing behind his eyes, that she had learned to read as the moment when Elias Cole Hartwell reasserted himself over whoever Eli Calloway had been becoming. She held the telegram out. It's addressed to me. Came through the county office. He took it. Read it. His jaw tightened once, almost imperceptibly. And then he handed it back with the controlled calm of a man who had practiced this. What does it say? She asked, though she'd read it twice already and knew exactly what it said. My brother is coming to Harlan Creek, Eli said. He'll be here Friday. He says he has business with your wife. Clara kept her voice even. That's me, apparently. He says he has information about the man I married that he believes I have a right to know. Eli looked at her. Not away, not at the ground, not at some middle distance. At her. Is he right? A long moment. The ice breaking around the water trough. The cold air. He's right. Clara folded the telegram. Then I think, she said, with a steadiness she was constructing in real time from whatever she could find, that you had better tell me before Friday what Caldwell Hartwell is planning to tell me. Because I will not sit across from your brother and learn the truth of you from someone who isn't you. He held her gaze. And then, for the first time since a cold November morning when he'd opened gray eyes in her barn, Eli Calloway sat down on the edge of the water trough in the February cold and started to tell her the truth. Hartwell Station was 300 miles northeast, outside a town called Breckett, and it had been in the Hartwell family for 2 generations. When his father, Edmund Hartwell, had died 4 years prior, the property had passed to both sons by the terms of the will. Eli the elder, Caldwell 3 years younger, with the operational control designated to Eli as the working partner and the financial control split evenly. Sounds reasonable, Clara said. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, which was not elegant, but was available. It was reasonable, Eli said. Until Caldwell started moving money. She went still. Moving it how? Quietly at first, small amounts. Investments, he said, were diversifying the portfolio, which was language our father used and which Caldwell had learned to use effectively because it stopped people from asking follow-up questions. He stopped. Something moved across his face, not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. The residue of betrayal that had been sitting long enough to settle. By the time I understood what he was actually doing, he'd leveraged the property against a land acquisition scheme in 3 counties. Bad paper. The kind that looks clean until somebody asks the right questions. How bad? Clara asked. If it had come due when it was supposed to, we would have lost Hartwell Station outright. Everything our father built. Everything our grandfather. He stopped again. Set his hands on his knees. I caught it. I went through the books myself over 3 weeks. Alone, because I couldn't go to Caldwell without evidence, and I couldn't go to anyone else without a short, harsh exhale, without destroying my brother, which I was not ready to do. I paid it. I liquidated my personal share of the estate investments. Savings, a property I'd purchased separately, and I cleared the debt. Quietly, without telling Caldwell, he looked at her. Which was a mistake. Why a mistake? Because clearing the debt without confronting him meant the scheme was still intact. He still had the relationships, the contacts, the paperwork. He could do it again. Eli's voice stayed level, but Clara could hear what it cost him to keep it that way. I confronted him. He paused. It didn't go well. He accused me of managing him, of undermining his authority in front of the workers, of treating him like a child. And the things he said about he stopped. It doesn't matter what he said. What matters is that I knew, standing in that office with my brother, that I had spent 35 years making excuses for who he was and cleaning up what he did. And that if I stayed at Hartwell Station, I would spend the rest of my life doing exactly that. Clara was quiet. Outside, the cold, the cattle moving somewhere near the south barn. So you left, she said. I left. With $25. With $25. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. Seemed fair. I'd paid my share in his both. The 25 was what was left of what I'd kept back for my own expenses. Clara sat with all of this. She sat with the shape of it, a man who had saved a family legacy from his brother's greed and then walked away from it, rather than spend the rest of his life repeating the saving. A man who had arrived on her fence post with $25 and a name that wasn't entirely his, and a quality of steadiness that she now understood came not from simplicity, but from having been through something large enough to clarify a person. What does Caldwell want? She said. I suspect he wants me to come back. Eli's voice was flat. He can't run Hartwell Station the way it needs to be run. And he knows it, and the people who work there know it. And he's been managing that knowledge for 8 months by telling them I had a breakdown and needed time. His jaw tightened. Which is the version of events that positions him as the reasonable one. And if you don't go back, he'll find another way to manage. Eli looked at her directly. That's not my concern right now. A pause. What I just told you. Whether it changes what you think of me. Clara looked at him for a long, measured moment. The morning cold around them, the breath clouds between them. It changes some things, she said honestly. It doesn't change the things that matter most. He held her gaze. Which things? You're still the man who reset my fence post. Who taught Thomas to read cattle? Who lets May instruct him on the proper feeding of a horse as though she invented the practice? She paused. The name and the property and the brother, that's the context. It's not the character. Eli looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Open almost, like a window that had been painted shut for a long time and had just been freed. Clara, he started. The back door banged open. Thomas. Coat half on, moving with the urgent energy of a boy who had news. There's a man at the front, Thomas said. On a horse. Not the same man as before. Different man. Says he's looking for Mr. Calloway. Eli and Clara both stood. What does he look like? Eli asked. Thomas considered. Dressed better than most. Younger. Looks like... He squinted at Eli with the frank assessment of childhood. Looks a bit like you around the eyes. But less, he searched for the word. Less settled. Eli closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then opened them. My brother, he said to Clara, quietly. He's early. Caldwell Hartwell was 32 years old, and he looked it in the way that men who have spent their lives indoors managing money look at well-dressed, well-fed, with the kind of smooth handsomeness that would age quickly and knew it. He had Eli's gray eyes, but without the quality that made Eli's gray eyes worth looking at. Where Eli's were steady, Caldwell's moved. Where Eli's held, Caldwell's calculated. Clara took all of this from the front step in approximately 4 seconds. Caldwell took her in at the same time. She watched him do it, the inventory. Rapid and practiced, the kind of assessment that started at the money and ended at the prospect. His eyes moved from her face to her figure to the house behind her to the land beyond. and back to her face, and she saw the moment he made his calculation. She'd seen that calculation before. She knew exactly what it meant, and she had long since stopped letting it determine how she stood. She stood up straight. She kept her hands easy at her sides. She said, "Mr. Hartwell, we weren't expecting you until Friday." Caldwell smiled. It was a good smile, technically. "Mrs. Calloway." He said the name with the slightest of pauses before it, which told her everything she needed to know about how he'd decided to approach this conversation. "I do apologize for the early arrival. I found I couldn't wait. Come in," she said. Because there was no version of this that was improved by having it outside. Eli was in the kitchen. He'd come in through the back. She knew, and he was standing beside the table with his arms crossed and his face closed. And when Caldwell walked through the front door and saw his brother, something passed between them that had years of history in it, years and money and a father's death and a reckoning that had apparently been postponed to a kitchen in Harlan County. Caldwell said. "Caldwell." Eli uncrossed his arms. "You're 4 days early. I was in the area. You were not in the area. You've never been south of Breckett in your life." Eli's voice was even, but there was steel under it, now that Clara hadn't heard before, or rather, that she'd heard briefly, in November, when he'd spoken to Dowd across the fence line. And that she understood now was the voice of a man who'd spent years being the one who did the hard things, and had not forgotten how. "Sit down or stand. Either way, say what you came to say." Caldwell glanced at Clara. "I had hoped we might speak privately." "My wife isn't private," Eli said. "Say what you came to say, a beat." Something flickered across Caldwell's face, surprise. Maybe, or reassessment. He'd clearly expected to find a different version of his brother here. He hadn't expected to find a man who used the word wife with that particular weight. Caldwell sat down. Clara put coffee on because she needed something to do with her hands, and because it bought her 30 seconds to think. "I came," Caldwell said, "because what Eli left behind him is not settled. And because I think his wife deserves to know the full situation before she finds herself in the middle of something she didn't know she was standing in." "Go ahead," Clara said. Setting cups on the table, Caldwell looked at his brother. "The debt you cleared, the land acquisition scheme, as you called it." He set his hands flat on the table. "It wasn't clean. The men I worked with on that acquisition, they've decided the clearing of the debt doesn't end their interest in the property. They've made contact with the county recorder in Breckett. They're challenging the original title." The kitchen went very quiet. Clara sat down slowly. Eli hadn't moved, his expression hadn't changed. But something in his eyes had a sharpening, the kind that comes when a man hears news he feared might be coming. "On what grounds?" he said. "On the grounds that the acquisition was part of a larger transaction they claim was never completed. That the payment you made was a partial settlement, not a full one." Caldwell leaned forward. "They say Hartwell Station still owes $70,000. The number landed in the room like something falling from a great height. Clara heard it and felt it simultaneously. $70,000 was not a number that existed in her comprehension of the world as a personal problem. It was a number that meant the end of something, possibly several somethings. "That's false," Eli said. His voice was quiet, absolutely controlled. "I have the receipts. I have the correspondence. The debt was cleared in full." "I know that," Caldwell said. "But they're claiming the correspondence was fraudulent. That the man who signed as their agent wasn't authorized to settle." "Who are they?" Clara asked. Both men looked at her. She kept her gaze on Caldwell. "The men my brother dealt with," Caldwell said carefully. "I understand that. Who are they specifically, and what do they actually want?" Caldwell blinked. He hadn't expected the question in that form. He'd expected, Clara guessed, to be speaking primarily to Eli, with her as a background concern. He revised quickly, she could see him doing it, and said, "Their primary interest is in acquiring the title to Hartwell Station's North Range. Approximately 4,000 acres. They believe it sits over a route they want for a rail spur, and they're prepared to manufacture a legal claim to get it. And you need Eli to come back and fight it. I need Eli to come back and sign the paperwork to contest it, Caldwell said. As co-owner of record, his signature is required for the legal challenge. Without it, he paused. Without it, the court will move forward with their claim unopposed. Clara looked at Eli. He was looking at the table, not the 1,000-mile stare she might have expected, something more focused than that. The look of a man running through options with the rapid efficiency of someone who had navigated complicated problems before and was applying that skill set to this one. Then he looked up at her, and what was in his expression in that moment she would think about it later. Much later, in the way you return to moments that mattered to understand why they mattered. He looked at her like she was the fix point, like she was the thing he was calculating from. I need a few days, he said. Not to Caldwell, to her. Take them, she said. If I go to Breckett, we're not in the middle of a crisis, Clara said. The land is safe. The cattle are all right. Thomas can manage the morning work for a few days. She paused. Go handle your family's business. Eli. Caldwell's eyes moved between them with an expression that Clara recognized, the expression of a man who had come expecting to find leverage and was discovering that the situation had fewer handles than he'd assumed. You'd send him back, Caldwell said. Not quite a statement. Not quite a question. I'd support him in doing what needs to be done, Clara said. There's a difference. A pause. You don't know what you're sending him back to. I know he's the one who cleaned up the mess the first time, Clara said. And I know you need him to clean it up again. And I suspect she held Caldwell's gaze steadily. That part of why you're here, specifically, in person. Early, talking to me before you gave him time to think. Is because you thought it would be easier to manage him through me than to simply ask him directly. The silence was complete. Caldwell stared at her. Whatever he'd prepared for this conversation, it had not included this. You thought, Clara continued calmly, that a woman who married a drifter to keep her land might be more manageable, more susceptible to the full picture of who she'd married. She paused. I think you may have misunderstood the situation. Eli made a sound. It was very small, and Clara doubted Caldwell heard it. But she did. And it was the kind of sound that falls out of a person when something releases in their chest without permission. Caldwell sat back. He looked at his brother. Eli said. She is. The corner of his mouth moved. You can stay in town tonight. I'll be there in the morning and we can go through the papers. Caldwell rose. He was reassembling himself. Clara could see composing the expression of a man who had achieved something like what he came for, even if the process had been somewhat different than planned. Of course. He looked at Clara, Mrs. Calloway. It's been clarifying. Safe ride, Clara said. She walked him to the front door. She watched him mount his horse and ride toward town. She stood on the front step in the February cold until he was gone. Then she went back inside. Eli was still at the kitchen table. He looked up when she came back in, and his face had the open quality it had briefly had before Caldwell arrived. But more so now, as if something had been unlocked that he wasn't going to relock. You didn't have to do that, he said. Do what? Make it plain what he was doing. He needed someone to make it plain. Clara sat down. She folded her hands. Eli, the property in Breckett. What happens if they win the legal challenge? They won't. But if they did, a pause. Caldwell would lose the North Range, possibly more. Depending on how the courts read the original transaction. He looked at her steadily. It wouldn't affect this property. I want you to be clear on that. I'm clear on that. That's not why I'm asking. She held his gaze. I'm asking because you left that property 8 months ago because you were done cleaning up after your brother. And now you're being asked to go back and do it again. And I want to know. She stopped. Try it again. I want to know what you want. Not what needs doing, what you want. He was very still for a moment. Then, I want the workers at Hartwell Station to keep what they've built. There are 20 families on that property. None of them had anything to do with Caldwell's dealings. He paused. And I want he stopped, set his hands flat on the table. I want to come back here when it's done. Clara heard that. She let it sit for a moment, the full weight of it, before she answered. Then go handle it, she said. And come back. He looked at her across the table. The fire in the stove, the February cold at every window. The house that had gradually, over 4 months, become something it hadn't been when he arrived. Claire, go handle it, Eli. She stood up. Supper's at 6 and Thomas is going to want to hear about your brother. So think about what you're going to tell him. She moved to the stove. Behind her, she heard the particular quality of silence that meant Eli Calloway was sitting at her kitchen table, feeling something he didn't quite have the words for yet. She understood. She was feeling something she didn't quite have the words for either. She stirred the pot. Outside, the February wind made its case against the walls of the house. Inside, the fire held. He left on Thursday morning, before the children were up. Clara was up. She'd been up since 4, which was not unusual, but this particular 4 a.m. had a different quality to it, the specific alertness of someone waiting for something they're pretending not to be waiting for. She made coffee. She heard him in the back room, the soft movement of a man packing the few things he had. And then he came into the kitchen with his coat and his hat, and the small bag that contained the entirety of what he owned. And he stopped in the doorway. Coffee's hot, she said. He put his bag down and sat at the table and accepted the cup she handed him. And they sat in the pre-dawn quiet that had become. Over these months, one of the things she valued most, this particular silence. This particular kitchen, this particular quality of being in the same room, with someone whose presence you'd stopped having to manage. I'll be a week, 10 days. We'll manage. I know you will. A pause. That's not, he stopped. Set the cup down. I didn't say I'd be a week because I was worried about the ranch. Clara looked at him across the table. I know, she said. I know why you said it. Another silence. The fire, the dark outside, the specific intimacy of 4:30 in the morning in a kitchen with another person. When I get back, Eli said, I owe you a complete accounting. Everything, the full truth of it, every part. He held her gaze. I want to give you that. I want you to have it before. He stopped again. Before what? She said very quietly. He looked at her with the storm-gray eyes that she'd read 100 different ways over 4 months. And this time what was in them was plain enough that reading wasn't required. Before anything else, he said. Clara breathed once. Steady. Go handle your family's business, she said. Come home. The word landed between them, home, and neither of them acknowledged it directly. Which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He stood. He took his bag. He put his hat on with the particular motion she'd watched 100 mornings. The slight adjustment that settled it just so. He paused at the door. Thomas is reading, he said. He's going to finish the almanac by the weekend. The agricultural journal on the second shelf, the one with the red cover, that's the next step. He can handle it. I'll tell him, Clara said. He stopped. May doesn't need anything. May is fine. May is always fine, Clara agreed. He looked at her one more moment. She held the look because she was done, pretending she needed to look away from him. Because pretending cost her something she didn't want to keep spending. Then he turned and went out the back door, and she heard his boots on the frozen ground fading toward the barn. And she sat at the kitchen table in the blue pre-dawn dark with her coffee, and listened to the house around her, and thought about the word she'd used, and what it meant that she'd used it without thinking, and how it had landed in the air. Between them, and neither of them had moved away from it. Home. She sat with that for a long time. Then Thomas appeared in the doorway in his stocking feet and nightshirt, rubbing his eyes with the expression of a boy who'd woken early for no discernible reason and was mildly indignant about it. Where's Eli? Thomas asked. He went to handle some business, Clara said. He'll be back. Thomas looked at the empty chair at the table. Then at Clara. Then back at the chair with the long, assessing look of someone taking an inventory. He took his bag, Thomas said. He'll be back, Clara said again, steady. Sure. Thomas looked at her. He had, in moments like this, the eyes of someone much older than 9. And the weight of what he saw in her face, she couldn't know what it was. Only that he saw something made him stand up slightly straighter. All right, he said, with the solemnity of a small man accepting a situation he'd decided to trust. He went to the stove and poured himself a cup of water. Clara watched him and thought, this child has more faith than I've earned. She was going to have to be worth it. She was going to have to be worth a lot of things before this was done. Outside, the February morning was starting to break. Pale and cold and reluctant, the way February mornings did. Somewhere in the distance, Captain made a low sound in his stall. May would be up in an hour. The cattle needed checking. The water needed hauling. The day was assembling itself around her the way days always did. Without asking permission, without waiting for the more important things to be settled first. Clara drank her coffee. She set the cup down. She stood up and reached for her coat. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And somewhere 300 miles northeast, a man with storm-gray eyes was riding toward a reckoning he'd been running from for 8 months. And the only thing he'd said before he left, that she was going to let herself hold on to, just for now, just until he came back, was the one thing that mattered most. I want to come back here when it's done. She put her coat on. She went out into the cold. She believed him. He was gone 9 days. Clara knew this because she counted them, not in the way of a woman pining, but in the way of a woman marking each day against the work that needed doing. The children who needed feeding, the cattle that needed moving. The particular calibration of a household that had quietly restructured itself around a person who was no longer in it. She didn't tell Thomas and May she was counting. She didn't need to. Thomas had his own internal ledger running. She could tell by the way he glanced at the East Road each morning before applying himself to the barn chores with the focused industry of a boy who had decided that being useful was his contribution to patience. May was more direct about it on the 4th day. She informed Clara over breakfast that Captain was sad. Captain seems fine to me, Clara said. He misses Eli, May said. With the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old who has decided something and will not be redirected. He stands differently when Eli isn't here. Clara looked at her scrambled eggs. Horses don't stand differently because of emotional states. May. Captain does, May said, and that was the end of it. Clara did not tell May that she understood the feeling. The 9 days were not easy days. February had not softened. The cattle cough that Eli had been watching spread to 2 more animals before Clara identified the pattern he'd been tracking and adjusted the feed mixture the way she'd seen him do it. And it worked, which told her something about how carefully she'd been paying attention to him without meaning to. The north fence held its repair, but the gate post on the east side developed a lean that needed addressing before it fell. And she addressed it herself, spending 2 hours in the cold with a post digger and determination, and the very specific vocabulary her father had used when things weren't cooperating, which she kept to herself because Thomas had ears like a barn cat. At night she sat at the kitchen table in the chair she'd started thinking of as hers, and looked at the empty chair from it and thought about things she'd been careful, for months, not to think about too directly. She thought about what it meant that she'd used the word home and meant it as an invitation. She thought about the look on his face in the pre-dawn kitchen, the open quality of it, the thing that had been locked for a long time and was coming unlocked. She thought about Caldwell Hartwell's assessment of her manageable, susceptible, a variable to be worked, and she thought about how Eli had sat very still and listened to her dismantle that assumption and made that small sound of released pressure that she kept returning to. She thought about what it meant to have a husband in name who was becoming something more complicated than a name. She thought about what it would cost her to let that be true. She had spent a long time, her whole adult life, really managing the cost of other people's perceptions. The whispers about her size, the assumptions about her prospects, the careful architecture of a life built to prove that she was worth something on her own terms, without needing anyone to confirm it. She had built that architecture carefully, and she had lived in it carefully. And the thing about carefully built structures was that you became very aware of what it would mean to let someone inside them. It would mean they could damage things. It would mean the cost of caring what they thought. It would mean the particular vulnerability of a person who has decided someone matters. And all the ways that could go wrong. She thought about all of this for 9 nights. On the 10th morning before breakfast, she heard a horse on the east road. She didn't run to the window. She walked to the window. With complete dignity and absolutely no hurry whatsoever. He came through the gate on a horse she didn't recognize, a bay. Well built, not the rental nag she'd expected, and he was wearing the same coat he'd left in, but he sat differently in the saddle than she remembered. Or maybe she was imagining that. He looked like a man who had gone somewhere difficult and come back having done what needed doing. Thomas was out of his room and at the window before she'd finished that thought. "He's back," Thomas said, with the carefully controlled relief of a boy who was not going to show how much he'd been waiting for this. "So he is," Clara said. May appeared from the hallway in her nightgown. Assessed the situation in approximately 1 second. And ran for the back door. Clara started. May was already gone. Clara put the coffee on. He came in through the back door with May wrapped around his left leg like a barnacle, which he was navigating with the patience of a man who had been greeted this way before and had no objection to it. He was carrying his bag in one hand and something else in the other, a folded document that he set on the kitchen table with the careful deliberation of something important being placed down. Thomas was leaning in the doorway to the kitchen with his arms crossed, attempting a studied casualness that didn't quite cover the relief in his eyes. "You're back," Thomas said. "I said I would be," Eli said. "You were gone 9 days. I said a week, maybe 10. 9 is between those." Thomas considered this with the expression of a boy determining whether this was satisfying. "Did you fix it?" "Yes," Eli said. "We fixed it." Thomas nodded once, the solemn single nod of someone accepting a report. Then the controlled neutrality broke, just slightly, into something younger and more honest. "Good," he said, and went back to his room, because he was 9 years old and had a dignity to maintain. Clara handed Eli the coffee without being asked and nodded at May, who was still attached to his leg. He reached down and disentangled her gently, and sat her in her chair with the ease of a man who had spent 5 months learning the specific gravitational requirements of a 6-year-old. "Breakfast in 20 minutes, Clara said. "You can tell me about it, then. It's already half settled," he said. His voice had the particular quality of exhausted relief, not happiness. "Exactly, but the sound of a person who has been holding something very heavy and has just been allowed to set it down. The papers are there." He nodded at the folded document. "The legal challenge collapsed 2 days ago. Their agent wasn't authorized. Like I said, once we put the right documentation in front of the right judge." The whole thing unraveled in about 4 hours. Clara glanced at the document, looked back at him, and a pause. "Caldwell," as he wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Caldwell is going to be managed differently going forward. I've arranged for a financial trustee, independent. Someone who doesn't owe Caldwell anything and can't be charmed." He paused. "It's not a punishment, it's a protection. For the property. For the workers. For Caldwell himself, honestly. Because he does better when someone else is holding the wider view." Did he accept that? He didn't have a choice. Eli looked up at her. "I'm still co-owner of record, and I made clear that if he interfered with the trustee arrangement, I would petition the court for a formal partition and sell my half, which would leave him with half a cattle operation and no working capital. He paused. He accepted. Clara sat down across from him. That must have been a difficult conversation. Most of the conversations in Breckett were difficult. He looked at her steadily. But they're done. The property is intact. The face on the land are safe. He set the cup down. I need to tell you something. Something in his tone shifted. Not heavier, exactly, but more deliberate. Clara straightened slightly. All right, she said. I had conversations in Breckett that I didn't expect to have. About what I was going back to. He held her gaze. About what I'd left here. A pause. My father's attorney was there for the legal proceedings. Old man named Garrett. Been with the family since before I was born. He asked me. Eli stopped. Seemed to choose his next words the way you'd choose footing on uncertain ground. He asked me if I intended to return to Hartwell Station permanently. What did you tell him? I told him level. Clear, no hesitation. I told him I had a life in Harlan County that I intended to get back to. Clara heard this. She let it settle. He must have found that surprising. He found it clarifying. Eli looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. He also told me something I need to pass on to you. Because it affects your situation. Garrett knew your father. Clara went very still. Joseph Whitmore, Eli said quietly. He and your father had a correspondence. Several years ago, Garrett was facilitating a land transaction in this county, and your father was one of the property owners involved. They exchanged letters for about a year. He paused. Garrett told me your father was one of the finest men he'd dealt with. That was the exact phrase. He looked at her. I thought you should know that someone said that. Someone who dealt with him professionally and had no reason to flatter. Clara's throat tightened. She reached up once quickly and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. And then she took it away and breathed and was fine. She was fine. Thank you, she said. Her voice was smaller than she'd intended. Your father also. Eli paused, with the careful timing of a man who understood that what he was about to say mattered and was choosing the right way to say it. There's a matter of a small account. Garrett found it in his records. Your father had been making payments into a fund held by Garrett's firm. Not much, a few dollars a month over several years. He designated it for his children. Eli reached into his coat and drew out an envelope, separate from the folded document, and set it on the table between them. Garrett sent it forward with me because he couldn't find a clear way to reach you directly. And when I told him who my wife was, the corner of his mouth moved. He said he was very glad to know you were being looked after. Clara looked at the envelope. She did not reach for it immediately. She was managing several things at once inside her chest, and she needed a moment. How much? Eli said. More than $60. Not enough to change everything. Enough to matter. She reached for the envelope. Held it without opening it. Her father's handwriting was on the front for my Clara girl, and that was what finally got her. That specific word, the one he'd used since she was 6 years old, and had never stopped using no matter how old she got. She stood up. She went to the window. She stood there for a moment, with her back to the room, while she conducted the business that needed conducting privately. And Eli said nothing, and that silence was the most eloquent thing he'd done in 5 months. When she turned back around, her eyes were dry, and her chin was level, and she set the envelope on the shelf above the stove, where she kept the things that mattered most. Breakfast. Eggs or biscuits? Both, said May, who had been sitting in her chair this whole time, with the polite patience of a child waiting for the adult portion of the morning, to conclude. Both it is, Clara said, and put the pan on. The town found out he was back before noon. This was not surprising. Harlan Creek had an efficient information economy. And Eli Calloway riding in from the East Road on a decent bay horse was the kind of observable fact that traveled fast in a place where new facts were scarce. By the time Clara went to Garner's store for supplies in the early afternoon, The intelligence had already been processed, and opinions had been formed, and she could feel them on her as she walked through the door. What she did not expect was Garrett Blaine. Garrett Blaine was 45 years old and the owner of the Harlan Creek Courier, which was the county's single newspaper and the primary vehicle by which Garrett Blaine expressed his feelings about the people in it. His feelings about Clara had been, for the past several years, a consistent background note of mild disdain, not malicious, not personal, simply the quiet dismissal of a woman he had categorized early and never thought to re-examine. A woman running a failing ranch, a large woman, a woman without prospect. He was standing at the counter when she came in, talking to Mr. Garner, and he turned when she entered and said, "Mrs. Calloway," in the particular tone of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity. "Mr. Blaine," she said, "I heard your husband has returned from up north." He had his notebook out, which meant this was for the paper, and she should be careful. "From Hartwell Station, is it? Considerable property up in Breckett County." "I understand. You'd need to ask my husband about his family's property," Clara said, moving to the counter. Of course. He made a note of something. "Only you can understand the community's curiosity. A man with that kind of background, working a small spread in Harlan County as a ranch hand. Married," he paused, in that specific way of a man choosing his next words to land somewhere, while pretending to choose them for accuracy. "Married to a local woman." He looked at her with the practiced sympathy of someone about to say something unkind. "Some people are wondering, Clara, was the arrangement mutually beneficial? Or was there an element of, shall we say, charity involved on one side?" The store was very quiet. Mr. Garner had found something to organize behind the counter. Clara looked at Garrett Blaine for a long, measured moment. She thought about Mrs. Fowler in December. She thought about the years of careful construction. The architecture of a life built to withstand exactly the implication that her worth was something that needed to be explained, or that love and dignity were commodities available only to women who met certain specifications. She thought about Eli at the kitchen table saying, "You are the most capable person I have met in the last 2 years." She thought about the envelope above the stove with her father's handwriting on it. "Mutually beneficial," she said, and her voice was clear and unhurried and carried no apology for its volume. "My husband came to this property when I needed help. He worked this land through the worst winter we've had in years. He helped me secure the banknote, manage the herd, and keep my family stable." She paused, "and I provided him with a home, a family, and someone who treated him like a person rather than a name on a property title." Another pause. "I'd call that remarkably mutual, Mr. Blaine. Is there something else you wanted for your paper?" Blaine looked at her. His mouth opened and closed once. "No," he said. "I think that covers it." "Good." She turned back to the counter. "Mr. Garner, the usual, please." She heard Blaine leave the store behind her. She kept her face toward the counter until she was sure the sound of his boots had faded. And then she exhaled very quietly, and Mr. Garner looked at her with a small nod of something she recognized as respect. "Good for you, Mrs. Calloway," he said low. "Thank you," she said. "I'll take that flower too." Eli was waiting for her when she got back. He was in the side yard, working on the east gate post. She'd been fighting with all week. He'd assessed it within an hour of getting back. Apparently, because that was what he did. He looked at the land and found what needed doing with the comprehensive attention of a man who had made this place his concern, and he straightened when he heard the wagon. He helped her down without asking whether she needed it, and took 2 of the supply bags from the wagon bed, which she also didn't argue about, because there was a difference between not needing help and refusing it out of pride. And she was trying to be done with the second thing. Garrett Blaine came by the store, she said, as they carried things toward the house. Eli stopped moving, not dramatically, just a pause in his step. Controlled and immediate. What did he want? To imply that our arrangement was charitable on your end, She kept walking. I disabused him of that. He fell back into step beside her. How? By saying exactly what is true, clearly and without apology. A pause. Are you all right? She looked at him sideways as they walked. I'm quite all right. I've been managing Garrett Blaine's opinions of me since I was 18. Today I was just less patient about it than usual. Less patient, he repeated. I've had a long winter. She pushed the back door open with her shoulder. And I find I have less tolerance for the version of this town that looks at my life and sees something that needs explaining. She set the bags down. You being back seems to have confirmed certain suspicions they were forming about you. About who you are. Hartwell Station, he said. Hartwell Station. She turned to face him. Eli. The town is going to recalibrate. They're going to decide that the Calloway marriage makes more sense to them now that they know there's property attached to you. And I need you to understand that I don't care about that. About the recalibration. I need you to understand that. She held his gaze. I didn't marry you because of what you had. I married you because of what needed doing. And what's happened since then has nothing to do with Hartwell Station. He was very still. I know that, he said. Good. She started putting supplies away. Clara. His voice stopped her. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and his expression was the open one, the unlocked one, and this time there was nothing behind it that was being managed. I need to say something. She waited. I gave you a false name, he said. I gave you a partial truth about my situation. I let you go weeks not knowing who you'd married. And I let that continue because he paused. Because it was convenient for me. Because being Eli Calloway was easier than being Elias Hartwell. And I used your household as a place to be that easier person. And you didn't have enough information to know that's what I was doing. He held her gaze. That was wrong. It was a choice I made that wasn't fair to you. And I need to say that plainly, not to explain it or excuse it. Just to say it. Clara looked at him. Sit down, she said. He sat. She sat across from him in the chair that was hers. Across from the chair that had become his. The name mattered, she said. I need to be honest about that. It mattered that you gave me something that wasn't fully true. Because I made a decision, a legal decision, a consequential one, without complete information. That's real. I'm not going to tell you it isn't, I know. And it mattered that I found out through a letter in a barn instead of from you. That mattered differently than the name, but it mattered. She folded her hands on the table. I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. I understand a man who needed to not be his name for a while. I understand what it is to need to find out what you're worth when all the usual measures are removed. She looked at him steadily. I've been doing that my entire life, every single day. A pause. So I understand it. But understanding it doesn't mean I'm going to pretend the months of partial truth were nothing. They were something. He held her gaze through all of this. Not flinching, not defending, just listening with the absolute attention of a man who understood that what was being said to him was important and was treating it accordingly. You're right, he said. I usually am, a beat. Her mouth moved very slightly at the corner. Don't make it a habit of confirming it. My head will get entirely too large. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not yet, but the thing that preceded it, the thaw before the release. Clara, I'm not finished, she said. The other thing I need to say is this. She took a breath. What you said before you left, about wanting to come back. About having a life here, she held his gaze. I need you to tell me what that means. Not the practical part, I've got the practical part handled. The other part. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the stove, the afternoon light, the kitchen that had held this winter and every conversation in it. It means, he said, slowly and clearly, choosing each word with the deliberateness of a man who understood their weight, that I came to this county with nothing, and I found something here that I didn't know I was looking for. That the house I woke up in was the first place in 3 years where I felt, he stopped. Tried again. Like I was in the right place. With the right people. He looked at her. With the right person. A pause. I know the circumstances of this arrangement weren't built for that kind of thing. I know you didn't sign that certificate with any intention beyond saving your father's land. And I know I don't have the right to. Eli, she said. He stopped. I signed that certificate, she said. Because I needed to save my father's land. That's true. She held his gaze steady. And somewhere between that morning in November and this afternoon in February, the thing I wake up thinking about first isn't the cattle or the banknote or the roof or the gatepost. She paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? He looked at her. The storm-gray eyes, steady and open and wholly present. Yes, he said. Very quiet. I understand. Good. She stood up. Her heart was doing something that she'd stopped trying to describe to herself. Supper in an hour. The bay needs water. He's been standing since you got in. He stood. He was looking at her with an expression that was almost too large for his face. That was trying to contain something that didn't quite fit in a controlled expression. Clara, he said. She stopped at the kitchen doorway. Thank you, he said, for believing I was going to come back. She held the doorframe for a moment. Then she looked at him over her shoulder. You said you would, she said. You've never told me anything that wasn't true. She paused. Even when the true parts were incomplete. She went down the hall. She heard him exhale behind her, that same sound. The releasing of something held, and she allowed herself. Alone in the hallway, a moment that was entirely her own. She pressed one hand flat against the wall and felt the solidity of it and breathed. And thought about her father, who had told her every morning of her life that she was worth something. She thought, I think I finally believe you, Papa. I think I'm starting to believe it the way you wanted me to. The town's recalibration happened faster than she'd expected. By the following Sunday, the story of Elias Cole Hartwell, of Hartwell Station, in Breckett County, being the same man as Eli Calloway, who'd been working the Whitmore spread since November, had made its way through every household in Harlan Creek. And the town's relationship to Clara underwent a shift that she observed with the careful, slightly sardonic attention she brought to all social phenomena. Mrs. Holt at the dry goods store was suddenly effusive. Mrs. Aldrich found her at Sunday service and took her arm and said, We always knew you were special, Clara, with such absolute conviction that Clara had to look away before her expression said something that couldn't be unsaid. Garrett Blaine ran a piece in the Courier about the Hartwell family's cattle operation being one of the finest in northeastern Texas, which was his way of recasting his prior assumptions as foresight. Eli, for his part, was extraordinary in his indifference to all of it. He continued doing exactly what he had been doing, working the land, checking the cattle, teaching Thomas the things Thomas wanted to know, appearing at mealtimes and in the kitchen evenings, and moving through the house with the ease of a man who he treating it like somewhere he might need to leave quickly. He responded to the town's increased cordiality with his usual even courtesy, and without the discomfort she might have expected. Because he had spent most of his life being Elias Hartwell and had a well-practiced facility for managing other people's recalibrations. What he was not indifferent to was her. She was aware of this. She was aware of it the way you become aware of weather, not by thinking about it constantly, but by registering it in your body before your mind catches up. The way he heard her coming before she came through a door. The way he asked about the specific things she hadn't mentioned worrying about. Which meant he was watching carefully enough to know what she wasn't saying. The way he had started, gradually and without announcement, doing the things she didn't have time to do, not her work, which she'd made plain was hers and which he respected absolutely. But the margins of work, the small things that fell between the necessary tasks and never got done. The hinge on the back door that had squeaked since October. The loose board in the hallway she'd learned to step around. The broken rung on the kitchen chair that wobbled. One morning she came into the kitchen and found the chair fixed, and she stood there looking at it for a moment before she sat down. And when Eli came in for breakfast and saw her looking at it, he said nothing. Just sat down across from her and poured his coffee. And she said nothing either, and that silence was the most honest conversation they'd had yet. It was Thomas who finally made it plain in the way children make things plain, by saying the obvious thing that adults are working too hard not to see. He came to Clara one afternoon when she was at her father's desk going through the season's accounts, and he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. In the posture he'd developed, she'd noticed, from watching Eli stand. "Are you and Eli going to stay married?" Thomas asked. Clara set down her pen. "Thomas, I'm not asking to be difficult," he said, with the seriousness of someone who had thought about the right way to ask this and was trying to execute the approach correctly. "I'm asking because May has started calling him Eli instead of Mr. Calloway, and I've been letting her do that because I thought it was probably fine. But if it's not fine, I should probably tell her to stop." Clara looked at her nephew. 9 years old, brown eyes steady, her brother's eyes in her brother's face, and behind them the particular intelligence of a child who had learned too early that adults didn't always tell you the things you needed to know to navigate your own life correctly. "It's fine," she said. "Fine like it's fine for now," Thomas said. "Or fine like it's fine permanently." Clara held his gaze. "Eli is here," she said carefully. "He's going to keep being here. I can't promise you what the future looks like in specifics because I'm still working those out. But I can tell you that." She stopped, thought about how to say what was true without saying more than she'd said to Eli himself. "I can tell you that Eli is not going anywhere, unless something changes that we can't currently predict. And I'm not expecting that." Thomas processed this. His expression moved through several stages that she recognized as the boy, sorting through what she'd said for the real meaning. "Do you love him?" Thomas asked. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That," she said, with the dignity of a woman being asked by a 9-year-old to account for the contents of her own heart, "is a work in progress." Thomas considered this. "But it's progressing." "Thomas, I'm just clarifying." Clara pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling briefly and looked back at him. "Go help with the evening water." "Yes, ma'am." He turned to go. At the doorway he stopped and looked back. "For what it's worth," he said, with the precise delivery of a boy who had saved his most important point for last, "May and I would be fine with it. Permanently." He went down the hall. Clara sat at her father's desk for a long moment and looked at the accounts she was no longer seeing. Then she pressed both hands flat on the desk and thought about progress and permanence and the specific weight of being told by a 9-year-old that you have permission to be happy. She picked up her pen. She went back to the accounts. She worked for another hour, and the whole time something warm was living in the center of her chest. And she didn't tell it to leave. Outside, she could hear Eli and Thomas at the water trough. And Thomas was asking a question about something in the earnest, comprehensive way he asked questions, and she could hear Eli's low, unhurried voice answering him, and May's voice somewhere nearby, saying something to Captain about carrots and the bay horse that Eli had brought from Breckett, making a sound of patient acceptance. This is what it sounds like, Clara thought. This specific arrangement of voices and sounds. This particular Tuesday in February. This is what it sounds like when a life decides to become something better than you planned for it. She would not say this out loud. She was not ready to say it out loud. But she set down the pen and listened for another minute. Just because she could. Just because it was there, and it was hers, and she had earned it through every difficult thing she'd ever done, and every morning she'd gotten up and kept going. Then she went back to the accounts. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like something to be glad about. March came in quietly, which Clara didn't trust. She'd lived in Texas long enough to know that when the weather went quiet between winter and spring, it was usually gathering itself for something. The cold didn't disappear, it just stepped back, assessed the situation, and decided on a different approach. She applied this principle to most things in life, not just weather, because it had never yet been wrong. What March brought first, before anything else, was a morning when she walked into the kitchen and found Eli already at the table with 2 cups of coffee poured and the deed to her father's land spread out in front of him. And something in the set of his shoulders told her this was not a casual breakfast conversation. She sat down. She pulled the closer cup toward her. She looked at the deed and looked at him and waited. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've had that thinking look for 3 days. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. That obvious. You go quiet in a particular way when something's working in you. Different from your regular quiet." She folded her hands around the cup. "Say what you need to say." He looked at the deed. Then at her. "The land is yours," he said. "Whatever happens between us, whatever the future looks like, this land stays yours. In your name, in your control, yours outright." He paused. "I want to put that in writing. Formally. I've already spoken to an attorney in Millhaven about the documentation. It just needs your signature and mine." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You think I'm worried about that? I think you should have the security of knowing it explicitly. Regardless of what you're worried about." He held her gaze. "When I came to you with a marriage arrangement, I had reasons that were practical, and yours were too. But the balance of that arrangement wasn't even. I came to you with a false name and a situation I hadn't disclosed. You came to it with everything you had." He paused. "This is how I start making that even." "Eli, I'm not finished." He didn't say it sharply. Just steadily, the way he said most things. "I also want to tell you that the trustee at Hartwell Station has been given clear instruction. My share of the operational income from the property, what comes to me quarterly, I want half of it going into a separate account in your name. Not mine, yours accessible only to you." Clara stared at him. "That is, Eli, that is completely unnecessary. It's not for necessity," he said. He searched for the word, equity. "It's so that the thing we have here, whatever it becomes, starts from an even place. So you never have to wonder whether you're standing on ground that could be moved without your consent." He held her gaze. "I know what it is to have the ground moved. I watched it happen to my father's estate. I will not be the person who creates that possibility for you." The kitchen was very still. The early March light, the coffee cooling between her hands. Clara looked at this man across her table, across her father's table, in her father's kitchen, on her father's land, and she thought about everything that had built to this moment. Every morning since November, every quiet evening, every conversation conducted in careful increments, both of them approaching the real thing from the sides because approaching it directly required a courage that had to be built up in layers. The way good land builds up, slowly and through work. "You understand," she said, carefully, "that if you do this, the deed, the account, all of it, there is no version of this conversation where I can continue pretending that what I feel is just practical." He looked at her. "Good. Clara," his voice was very quiet. "Absolute. I'm not doing this to obligate you to anything. I'm doing it because you deserve to stand on solid ground." And because he paused, set his hands flat on the table in the way he did when he was going to say something, to stop being careful about. "Because I love you. And I know the way this started. And I know that word carries weight in a situation like ours. And I'm not saying it to pressure you or to rush you. I'm saying it because it's true, and I'm done managing it down to something more convenient to carry." The word sat in the kitchen air between them. Clara looked at him. She felt the thing in her chest that she'd been calling by other names for months because it was easier that way, practical, reasonable, manageable, and she let it be what it actually was for the first time. there in the morning light, with her coffee going cold and her father's land deed on the table. Thomas told me, she said, that the situation was progressing. Eli blinked. Thomas. He asked me directly whether I loved you. Several weeks ago. I told him it was a work in progress. She looked at her cup. Then at him. I think the work is done. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been built over 5 months. Every day, and every cold morning, and every quiet evening, and every moment of two people who had approached each other slowly enough to actually arrive. He reached across the table, set his hand palm up between them. Not a demand. A question. She looked at his hand, the calloused palm. The scars she'd stopped speculating about, because she knew now what they meant, not violence, but work. A lifetime of doing what needed doing with his hands. She put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers. Once carefully, like a man handling something of real value. They sat there for a moment in the morning light, without saying anything else. Because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. And Clara thought, this is what my father meant. Every morning of my life he told me I was worth something. This is what he meant by it. Not this man specifically, but this: the right to stand in your own life and have someone take your hand without asking you to be smaller than you are. She squeezed his hand once and picked her coffee back up. We'll need to go to Millhaven for the paperwork, she said. Thursday, he said. If the weather holds. The weather's going to hold. She looked at the window. It's done with us for the season. He looked at the window too. You're sure? I know this land. She stood up. Breakfast in 20 minutes. Tell Thomas the almanac question he had about spring cattle rotation. I've been thinking about it, and I think I have a better answer than you gave him. He looked up at her with an expression that was new, or rather, that was the unlocked version of something she'd been seeing in pieces for months. Fully assembled now, and not trying to be anything other than what it was. You were listening to that conversation. I always listen, she said. I'm a woman running a cattle operation. Listening is how I've kept everyone alive. She moved toward the stove. Also, you were wrong about the rotation. The east pasture needs to go first, not the north. I wasn't wrong, he said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before, something lighter. Something that was the beginning of what he would sound like when he'd been fully home long enough to trust it. I was building toward the right answer through a logical sequence. You were wrong, she said pleasantly. Eat your breakfast. She heard him laugh. It was a quiet laugh. Unhurried, the kind that comes from a deep place rather than the surface. And it was the first time she'd heard it at full volume and without restraint. And it landed somewhere in her chest with the particular resonance of something that was going to be important for a long time. She smiled at the stove. She kept it there just for herself, where no one could see it. She was allowed that much. The news that Elias Cole Hartwell of Hartwell Station had been living and working on the Whitmore spread as a common ranch hand and had married the Whitmore woman in November without disclosing his identity made its full circuit through Harlan Creek on the first warm Tuesday of March. And the circuit was, to Clara's privately entertained observation, spectacular. It moved through the town in waves. The first wave was shock, the genuine, unpolished variety, the kind that makes people stop mid-sentence and reconsider what they thought they knew. The second wave was reinterpretation, the rapid social process by which everyone revised their prior opinions to suggest they had always suspected something notable about the Calloway situation. The third wave was the one Clara found most interesting. The wave that reached the women who had whispered about her size, about her prospects, about the obvious inadequacy of a woman like her attracting a man of any standing. She didn't go looking for that wave. She didn't need to. It came to her. It came in the form of Mrs. Fowler, who appeared at her front door on a Wednesday afternoon with a pie and an expression of determined contrition that told Clara she'd been composing this visit for several days. Clara let her in, because she was not the kind of woman who turned people away from her door. And also because she was curious, and also because she'd learned from 5 months of watching Eli Calloway handle difficult situations, that the dignified move was usually to let the other person say what they came to say. Mrs. Fowler sat at the kitchen table and set the pie between them and said, "I owe you an apology, Clara."
For which is part.
Clara said. Pleasantly, Mrs. Fowler had the grace to flinch. December. At Garner's store, she folded her hands. "It was unkind and it was wrong, and I've known it since I said it, and I should have come sooner." Clara looked at her. She looked at the pie, which was apple, which was Clara's favorite, and which Mrs. Fowler had clearly ascertained somehow. She thought about what she wanted to do with this moment, what it would cost her to hold it, and what it would cost her to let it go. She thought about her father, who had never held a grudge in his life, because he'd said grudges were debts you paid out of your own pocket. "I appreciate you coming," Clara said, "and I accept the apology." She paused. "I want to say something in return, and I need you to hear it without defensiveness." Mrs. Fowler looked at her hands. "All right. What you said in December, that my husband's reasons couldn't be real, wasn't just unkind to me. It was a particular kind of unkind that says, a woman who looks like you cannot be genuinely loved. That kind of thing." Clara kept her voice even. "It lands differently than you might think. Not just in that moment. It lands in all the moments before it and all the ones after it. Because it confirms something that people have been saying your whole life in 100 different ways." She looked at Mrs. Fowler steadily. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse. I'm telling you so that the next time you're about to say something like that to a woman, any woman, you know what you're actually saying." Mrs. Fowler's eyes were wet. She pressed her lips together. "I didn't think of it that way." "I know," Clara said. "Most people don't." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Clara got up and cut the pie and poured coffee. Because the conversation had said what it needed to say, and there was no point in making the woman sit in discomfort any longer than was useful. Mrs. Fowler left an hour later looking lighter than she'd arrived, which Clara took as an adequate outcome. She stood on the front step watching her go and thought about Grace, not the religious variety, though that was in there too, somewhere in the architecture her father had built, but the practical variety. The kind that was a choice you made deliberately, not because it cost you nothing, but because you'd decided the alternative cost more. Eli came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn. He stopped when he saw her expression. "You all right?" he said. Mrs. Fowler came to apologize. He was quiet for a moment. "How'd it go?" "Well enough." She turned back toward the door. "I told her what I needed to tell her. She heard it." A pause. "She makes a decent apple pie." "High praise," he said. "It is from me." She looked at him over her shoulder. "The Eastgate post is leaning again. Something hit it." "I saw it," he said. "I'll get it before supper." "I know you will," she said, and went inside. The twist that March brought, the one Clara hadn't seen coming. Which was the thing about twists? They came from the directions you'd stopped watching, arrived in the form of a letter from Breckett County that was not from Caldwell. It was from the 20 families on Hartwell Station land. Signed by all of them. Eli read it at the kitchen table on a Friday evening after Thomas and May were in bed. He read it once, put it down, picked it up and read it again. And Clara watched his face during the second reading and saw something there that she hadn't seen before, something exposed and a little unguarded. The expression of a man being reminded that the things he did when he thought no one was keeping track had been kept track of after all. "What does it say?" she asked. He set it down and pushed it toward her. She read it. 20 families. 20 signatures, some careful and practiced. Some labored and slow. Some clearly made by people who didn't write often, but had decided this was worth the effort. The letter said, in the plain collective language of working people who didn't use extra words, that Elias Hartwell had saved their homes 8 months ago when he'd cleared the debt his brother made, and that they'd known it at the time, though he'd never told them, and that they were telling him now because it seemed like he needed to hear it. That a man who saved what others built and asked nothing for it was a man worth knowing. That they hoped he was well, that the station was holding. The trustee was fair, and the cattle had come through winter intact. At the bottom, in a different hand from the rest, a single additional line. Come back and visit when you can. Bring your wife. We'd like to meet the woman who found you worth keeping. Clara set the letter down. Eli was looking at the table. 20 families, she said. Yes, you never told them. It wasn't something I wanted them to know. It would have changed, he stopped. It would have changed how they looked at Caldwell. And whatever Caldwell is, he's still their employer. And they need that relationship to work, and yet they knew anyway. People who work land together for years, he paused. They know things, even when no one tells them. Clara looked at him. The letter between them, the fire in the stove, this kitchen that had held everything. All winter, every hard thing and every quiet thing and everything that had been building from the moment a woman with good instincts and no money to spare decided to drag an unconscious man off her fence post. Eli, she said. He looked up. You saved their homes and walked away and never asked for credit. She held his gaze. And then you showed up on my property with $25 and fixed my fence posts and taught my nephew to read cattle and let a 6-year-old instruct you about horse etiquette. She paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I think so, he said. His voice was very low. I'm telling you that the man who did those things in Breckett and the man who showed up on my fence post are the same man. That the name on the deed and the name in my kitchen are the same person. She reached across the table. The way he'd reached across to her weeks ago and set her hand palm up between them. And I would like that person to stop thinking he has to earn the right to be here. He looked at her hand for one moment. Then he covered it with his. I love you, he said. Because he'd said it once, and it had been true, and it was still true, and he was done managing it. I know, she said. I love you too. She closed her fingers around his. Don't make it into a large thing. There's work tomorrow. The corner of his mouth moved. Then moved further. And then Eli Calloway, Elias Cole Hartwell. The man from Hartwell Station. The man from her fence post. Her husband in name, who had become her husband in fact, through every day of this long and difficult and astonishing winter, smiled. A full, unguarded, unmanaged smile, the kind that changed a face completely. And Clara thought, there it is. There's the person who's been in there the whole time. There's always work tomorrow, he said. There is, she agreed. It's one of the things I like about this life. They sat like that for a while. The letter from Breckett on the table between them. The fire, the quiet house with 2 children sleeping in it. Outside, the March night held the first real softness of the coming spring. And Clara could feel it through the walls, not warm yet. Not fully, but present, the way good things are present before they arrive completely. They renewed their vows on a Saturday in late April. Though they didn't call it that exactly. What Clara said to Eli was, I'd like to say the words again. The real words. Not the ones we said to save my father's land. But the ones that mean what we actually are. He said, tell me when and I'll be there. She'd planned it without fuss. Because Clara Whitmore had never been a woman who required fuss and didn't intend to start. The same preacher, a different morning, the same county clerk's office with the same Mr. Tibbs and his mole, Thomas in his best shirt, May in the dress she'd worn exactly once before and kept folded with the reverence of a child who understood some things were kept for important occasions. This time when Mr. Tibbs asked if anyone had objection. May said, I don't, with the proactive helpfulness of a 6-year-old who had decided to assist the process. The preacher's mouth did something complicated. Eli's mouth did something that was fully a smile. Clara pressed her lips together. May, she said quietly. I was being helpful, May said. You were. Thank you. When the preacher got to Eli's turn and asked if he took Clara as his lawful wife, Eli turned to her before he said it and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for months directly. Wholly, with the quality of attention that made you feel seen in the deepest way, and said, I do, in a voice that everyone in that small room heard clearly. When he asked Clara, she didn't hesitate this time. Not for 1 second. I do, she said. Mr. Tibbs stamped the new certificate. The mole moved. The morning light came through the window. They walked out onto the main street of Harlan Creek. The four of them, and the town was going about its Saturday business around them. And some people looked, and some people nodded, and some people looked away. And Clara held the certificate in her left hand, and felt none of the weight she'd felt the first time. What she felt was something entirely different, something solid and sure and warm. The particular feeling of a person standing exactly where she is supposed to be. Eli took her hand. Not dramatically, not with an audience in mind. Just took her hand, there on the street, the way a man takes the hand of someone who is his to take care of, and who has consented to be taken care of in return. Thomas watched this with the solemn satisfaction of a person whose question about permanence has been definitively answered. May said, Can we get pie? Yes, Clara said. The same place as before? The same place. May took Eli's other hand with the absolute authority of someone who has decided this is how things are now, and has no intention of revisiting the matter. They walked to the Mill Street Cafe, all four of them. In the April sun that was finally doing the thing it had been threatening to do all March, actually warming. Actually committing, the way spring eventually does when winter finally loses the argument. Thomas had his pie. May had 2 bites of hers before becoming more interested in describing to Eli the specific emotional state of Captain that morning, which was apparently pensive, and which Eli accepted as a credible observation. Clara sat at the window table with her coffee and watched her family. That word, that particular arrangement of people she'd built around her, out of necessity and stubbornness and one unconscious man on a fence post, and she thought about everything that had led here. She thought about November, the marriage certificate she'd signed with a shaking hand, the practical arrangement, the name she hadn't verified, the fence post. She thought about the letter from her father above the stove. For my Clara girl. She thought about him every single morning, and she suspected she always would. And that was all right, because some people earned that kind of permanence in your heart. And Joseph Whitmore was one of them. She thought about Mrs. Fowler's apple pie, and the apology she'd accepted and the grace she'd chosen. And what it felt like to choose grace not from weakness but from the specific, hard-won strength of a woman who had decided she wasn't going to carry anyone else's unkindness around anymore. She thought about the 20 families in Breckett who had signed their names and said, Come back. Bring your wife. We'd like to meet the woman who found you worth keeping. She thought about Mrs. Holt and Mrs. Aldrich and Garrett Blaine and every person in this town who had looked at her over the years and made their calculation and gotten it wrong. And she thought about how completely uninteresting their recalibration was to her now, and how freeing it was to be completely uninterested in it. She thought about a woman who had spent her whole life being measured against a standard she'd never agreed to, and had spent every day of that life quietly, stubbornly, relentlessly proving that the standard was the wrong one. She looked at Eli across the table. He was listening to May with the full attention he gave everything. And May was explaining something about horses with her hands. And Thomas was reading the back of the sugar tin, because Thomas was always reading something. And the sun was coming through the window, and the coffee was good, and the pie was mostly eaten, and the certificate in her coat pocket had both their names on it, written in their own handwriting, for real this time. Eli looked up and found her watching him. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. He reached across the table and touched the back of her hand once. very briefly, and she turned her hand over and caught his fingers and held them for exactly 1 moment before May said his name and required his attention back. And he went back to listening to May, and Clara went back to her coffee. And nobody watching them would have thought the exchange was remarkable at all. Which was exactly how she wanted it. Because this ordinary Tuesday in April, this cafe table, this coffee, these children, this man, this was not a remarkable thing. This was not a thing that required explaining or justifying or defending against anyone's assessment of its likelihood. This was just her life, her actual life, the one she'd fought for and kept and refused to let anyone else define. The one she had built in the hardest season she'd ever known, with the most unlikely materials she'd ever worked with. And it had turned out to be the strongest thing she'd ever made. She set her cup down. She looked out the window at the April street. Warm and ordinary and entirely hers. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Hartwell now. Though she kept the Whitmore too, because it was her father's name and she had earned the right to carry. Both understood something in that moment. Completely, and without reservation, the way you understand things that have been true for a long time, and are only now available to be known. She was worth every good thing that had found her. She had always been worth it, and she was done completely and permanently, and with great satisfaction waiting for the world to figure that out.